Multiplicity, the idea of the self as everything, everywhere, all at once. It's the freedom to express the many selves we are and the ones we wish to be. Even as the world tries to box us in with perceptions, stereotypes, and expectations, the artist's journey to express multiplicity reflects the universal desire to be seen. But how does this journey begin? What inspires artists to find their voice and express their many selves? How do they summon the courage to reveal themselves in the face of new challenges and uncharted territory? What does it mean for artists to live on the edge, to take risks, and present themselves to the world? These are some of the questions that we'll explore today on Edge of Reason. A limited series podcast produced by Atlantic Rethink, the Atlantic's creative marketing studio, in partnership with Hauser Wirth, a home to visionary modern and contemporary artists. This season, we explore the line where left brain meets right brain, where logic and reason and creativity begins, and how personal and universally resonant themes connect art with the human experience. Joining us on this episode are two visionary artists who fully embody the power of being multifaceted, both as creators and as individuals. Glenn Ligon is a conceptual artist best known for his work exploring race, language, and history. Solange Knowles is a musician, performance artist, and creative visionary whose work moves fluidly between disciplines. Together, they'll explore what it means to embrace creative freedom, to reject limitations, and to carve out space not only for their own multiplicity, but also for those who will come after them. Their work serves as a reminder that we are never just one thing, and that through art, we can open new paths for expression and understanding. Glenn Ligon, I'd love to start with you. You're a visionary conceptual artist whose work transformed the art world in the 1990s and continues to push boundaries across mediums. You're known for iconic text-based pieces like Untitled, I'm a Man, and the Runaways series, and your work embodies the idea of multiplicity. By blending historical and personal narratives, you reveal the many layers that define us, challenging us to see identity as fluid and ever-evolving. Glenn, we're so happy to have you here on Edge of Reason.
Thank you for inviting me.
I wanted to take you back to the start of your artist years, because very early on, you began as an abstract expressionist painter. And I wonder, was it hard back then to give yourself permission to break out of that mold?
Well, I think, if we're talking about freedom, abstract expressionism in the late 70s, early 80s, when I was in school, was for me some kind of model of, absolute freedom. You just put a brush on canvas and started painting and see what came of it. But at that point, late 70s, early 80s, abstract expressionism had been around for 30, 40 years. So at best, I was a third, fourth generation abstract expressionist. And I didn't feel like the content of the work had any relationship to, in some ways, the content of my life. All the things I was reading, all the things I was listening to musically, there was no space in those paintings for that. And so I had to, in some ways, make a break from that freedom in order to find a way of working that could incorporate all the things that I was interested in or touched by or was reading.
What did you have to do in order to give yourself the kind of freedom to express yourself in a new way?
Literature was super important to me when I was in college, and it was my introduction to Baldwin, Richard Wright, Zora Neale Hurston, the classics, the giants of African-American literature. But it took me maybe 7, 8 years, maybe even longer, to realize that material that I was reading, those essays, those novels, was actually the basis of the work. And took me another couple of years to figure out how to get those words into the work. And I came up with a very simple solution, was make text paintings, incorporate the quotes that I was thinking about, sort of text that I was reading, thinking about directly into the work. It became the work.
You had a breakthrough with the text-based works I Am a Man in 1988 and How It Feels to Be Colored Me in 1991. From there, your art expanded into different forms. You got into painting, photography, installation, even coloring books, and neon sculptures. And now, with 2 books coming out, including Distinguishing Piss from Rain, you're emerging as a writer and a critic with sharp insights and a unique philosophy. Did you always see your writing and painting and curating as interconnected, or has this been more of a recent development?
I always say that I'm a painter, and that I think over time becomes a kind of limit, as if painting were the most important thing in my practice. But now I think making neons, writing, curating, all of those things are part of my practice, part of my artistic practice. When I was writing, when I was working on a curatorial project in the museum space, when I was in the studio making paintings, they all seem like separate activities. But I think in the last couple of years, I've realized that they're all of a piece. It's as hard to make a painting as it is to write about an artist like David Hammons or, Jack Whitten. And I get the same kind of rewards from them. So I realized that all of these things are actually under the heading of being an artist, So it's been exciting for me to kind of take joy in all of these different ways of working and not prioritize them, not say, well, this one is more important than that one.
I'm excited to dig into this with you. But first, let's welcome our guest, Solange Knowles, an acclaimed singer-songwriter best known for her unforgettable 2016 album, A Seat at the Table. Beyond music, she's a true multi-hyphenate artist, choreographer, record label head, artistic director, video director, performance artist, and the founder of the multidisciplinary creative agency St. Heron. Her work's been presented at prestigious venues like the Guggenheim, the Getty, the Hammer Museum, the Tate Modern, and the Venice Biennale. Solange, welcome to Edge of Reason.
Thank you so much for having me, Jeff. It's exciting to be here.
So when and how did you come to see yourself as an artist? Was there like a moment, maybe even in childhood, when it all came together for you?
Yes, I've actually been thinking a lot about this lately. I was about 9 years old and I went to a summer camp at the Ensemble Theater, which is a historically Black theater in Houston. And it was an incredible program. They had a lighting department, they had a costume department, they had a workshop teaching us how to write monologues. And at the end of the program, we were to present a monologue to our peers. And I remember very distinctively thinking that I wanted to apply all of this new learned knowledge and all of these sort of facets of expression into my monologue. And so I remember sitting with my camp director and saying, I want to discuss lighting cues when I say this one part of my monologue. I want the lights to do this, and I want to create a costume. I think that was sort of my first affirmation into world making. Realizing that the space around the work was just as important as the work itself. And I think it gave me such an incredible sense of direction and confidence. And so, yeah, I think that was sort of the start of the trajectory into multiplicity. And from there, I just continued to develop and work through these parts of myself, even as a child, whether it be dance or songwriting. I felt like I had something to say and that there were so many directions and paths to get there.
But it sort of expanded over the years. And it seems like 2019 was maybe the moment that the world really got to see you not just as a singer, but as a performance artist, as a choreographer, as someone deeply engaged in making Black contemporary art. But this is, I guess what you're saying is this has actually been in you all the whole time.
Yes, I feel like it has. I feel like from that time at the ensemble theater, something was really birthed in me. And I was really lucky that I got to really develop and work at these different expressions, whether it be choreography, dance, writing, music making. And I think with the performance pieces, I was able to combine all of those, but create more expansion within sculpture, within text, within sort of physical artifacts of sort of timestamps of what the performance was, whether it be making a book afterwards or creating a program. And so I was able to sort of bring all of these worlds together through those performance pieces.
Well, let's jump into this conversation. I know this is a rare opportunity for the two of you to finally have a conversation. I know it's something that hasn't really happened before, and I'm sure both of you are eager to dive in. But before we get into that, I'd love to set the stage with one question. Our theme today is multiplicity. How do each of you define it? And what resonates with you when you think about multiplicity in your own artistic practice?
I think multiplicity, if I have to think about what it means in terms of my practice, is not making huge distinctions between things that I'm doing. So curating exhibition is different than working in your studio, but it requires the same kind of energy, the same kind of focus, the same kind of collaborations with people, talking through things, letting chance intervene in the process. So all the inputs that I get when I'm working in the studio are the same kind of inputs I'm getting when I'm thinking about writing or thinking about curating an exhibition. It's a beautiful way to think about bringing your whole self to the work you do, but also realizing that one form of your creativity touches people in a particular way, but that is different than if they are holding an object that you've designed or created. I was just thinking about the muscle to push yourself, growing new muscles, pushing your practice in a different direction. When I was making my moon jars, I'd never made ceramics before, found this ceramicist who lived in Japan. He had the expertise, but I realized, the black moon jars that I ended up baking with him, he would have thrown half of them out. They were not his thing, but I realized I pushed him to make something he never would have made. But because he makes perfect things and mine are imperfect, but that imperfection was maybe, that was the collaboration, getting him to make imperfect things that matched my vision rather than the perfect things that he would have made that were all about his vision.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. I can't tell you how many projects I've had to put on ice and sort of let thaw out. And I think time can be a really great gift in that way. You're able to return to something with a sense of clarity or a sense of experience that has happened throughout that time that gives you more of an impulse to say, yes, this is right. This is a real reflection of how I feel and something that I can back being out in the world. And so when I think about what the risks are, I think about the vulnerability to fail. I know with the glassware, I had a very similar experience in that I looked really hard to find a Black glass blower to fabricate that. I think that it was really important to me that from idea, conception, to production that this sort of stayed in Black hands and a Black spirit. And I found Jason McDonald from Tacoma, Washington. And he was a Venetian trained glass blower. And so my designs and my concepts, very similar to yours, were not really a part of his wheelhouse. And if anything, you know, he sort of had the sentiment of like, oh, I can do this in my sleep. These are really easy expressions. But once we actually got into the hot shop and we actually started to refine and sort of build these out, it became much more challenging than either of us anticipated. And so we had to come up with creative solutions and bend a little bit, which was very telling when speaking about the material of glass, because you're constantly sort of bending and adjusting yourself and emotion and surrendering to this material because otherwise it'll break. And so I really utilized that process as sort of an allegory for the lessons I needed to learn internally, which is that when you're taking that risk, entering a new world, that you have to be willing to surrender to the process. I know with El Dorado Ballroom, the performance series that I've curated through Saint Huron, last year we premiered the series at BAM, and one of the performances with Linda Sherrock was really, it was a risk in itself, being that Linda was a performer who hadn't performed in 20 years. And so it all has to sort of ground itself in something that you're willing to fight for, that you're willing to stand by, and that you're willing to surrender to in the process. And I've been very lucky that the payoffs have been there for the most part.
Now, for those unfamiliar with her music, Linda Sherrock is an iconic avant-garde jazz vocalist. She's best known for her groundbreaking experimental style. She gained prominence in the 1960s and the 1970s for her collaborations with the saxophonist Pharoah Sanders and later the guitarist Sonny Sherrock.
I was actually at BAM to see Linda Sherrock perform. It was an amazing concert because she kind of like, it was almost like she was saying like, I may not be here again, so I'm going to give it my all tonight. And we thought the concert was over, and she's like, I'm not done.
As a curator and program director, I was backstage sweating bricks because, you know, I was like, curtain close. I like things to be with precision. And she gave me the look like, it ain't over. Open those curtains back up. I got more to say. And that was a risk in that moment. The audience could have been like, what's going on? But everybody really embraced the moment that we were all sharing together. And, you know, that was a really special night as well because Claudia Rankin, I had her perform some poems, and Glenn, we realized that we had her in common and that your work had been featured in Citizen, and that Citizen was a huge starting place for me in writing a seat at the table. So that was another cool sync that we had.
Also, what was nice about that evening was they are not people you would normally think of together sharing a stage. You know, the people who were coming to see Claudia may not be the people who were coming to see Linda, or the other way around. But I think what you did, Solange, and you have done consistently throughout your career, is make these spaces for people to be in dialogue and conversation, another form of multiplicity.
Oh, I appreciate that. That means so much. It ain't always easy, but it truly is the most fulfilling work. And it's one of my favorite parts of my job is bringing people together in conversation and celebrating our stories and celebrating all of the syncs in our stories, all of the threads in our stories, and finding that sort of common ground between us, especially as Black artists and Black women artists. We share so many of the same stories and journeys that it takes to get there. And that reflection and that seeingness in one another is a really powerful force. And I feel really honored and humbled to be able to do that work.
If I may, let me bring us back to the brilliant Claudia Rankine for a moment and her powerful book, Citizen, which explores microaggressions, though really microaggressions are just aggressions, right? It got me thinking about the risks that each of you take as artists, both personally and publicly. Citizen reminds me of how Claudia writes about how it feels to be perceived or misperceived by another person, and the effect that that has on one's physicality and emotionality. How do you navigate those moments when you're in similar situations?
I think a lot about the night that I released When I Get Home, my latest album. And I already kind of knew that it was going to be work that needed to sort of be sat with. I was deep in the throes of repetitions and the way that mantras were really transforming my life. But I kind of knew that starting an album saying I saw things I imagined for an entire song, maybe 20 times, that there would be a pause. And so I definitely was a part of the dialogue that night. It was very sort of split. There was a large part of my fan base and my audience that immediately connected to this work and immediately understood what I was trying to achieve and understood that while A Seat at the Table was much more lyrical, that this sonically was saying in some ways even more. It took time for me to have the courage to write those songs. And people often tell me 5 years later that of all my albums, it's their favorite album, but that it took them a year or them 6 months to really sort of be transformed by the process, and that it sort of spiritually resonates for them, where A Seat at the Table maybe more leads with the mind, that When I Get Home leads with the spirit. And so I think as an artist, it's important to sit with that process and people's walk and people's journey with your work, and to not be critical or disappointed or swayed by that. I mean, of course, we're human, so we're gonna feel things. But I think when you feel like you're at a point where you're standing sort of 10 toes down in what you've created, and that being the mirror in which you needed to see yourself in, then you're able to meet people with grace. And I think when I think about my favorite artists and the multiplicity they have, there are different eras of representing themselves that are wildly different. And I think it's impossible to carry everybody along with you on the journey to all these different versions of yourself.
It seems like there's always going to be, people who understand the deep cuts, and you kind of rely on them when maybe your audience isn't quite gone with you yet or needs some time. So I rely on those, few artists who I was like, okay, this is what I'm doing. What do you think? And they get the deep cuts. They see the through line in the work. And as you said, Solange, sometimes it takes people longer to catch up to things. And I feel like I have the same process. Things that I didn't like in my studio that I made, 5 years later, I was like, wait a minute, actually, there were great ideas in there. What was I thinking? I just needed to catch up to it.
I love that answer.
Glenn, you and the curator, Thelma Golden, famously coined the term post-Black, partly as an in-joke, right? But partly as an insightful, maybe inciting way of describing how Black art was changing with a new generation of artists. But the question I had in my mind was about legacy. In terms of multiplicity, do you think your work has broadened how the public sees and understands Blackness? And what does that mean for creating opportunities for younger generations? How has the practice of multiplicity changed from when you were breaking down barriers to where it stands now today?
Well, I think my sister Thelma Golden, dear friend, when we were talking about this notion of post-Blackness, yes, as it started out in a way as a kind of an aside, a joke in some ways, me saying to Thelma, oh, another one of those shows with your post-Black artist children, but not, having a clear sense of what that meant or having a clear sense that that term, post-Black art, might be taken up in the, art historical discourse, But I think it was just a way of signaling, in a way, a break from a generation of artists that I was embedded in to a younger generation of artists who were deeply, deeply interested in Black culture, things coming from Black culture, but also deeply interested in redefining what it could mean, sort of not being afraid to be abstract Black artists. Where, for an earlier generation, that was a touch point that had to be debated. Black artists need to be making figurative work to speak to the people. And those debates just weren't, for a group of younger artists, just weren't debates that they were having. They found no contradiction in the ways that they were working and an exploration of Blackness in those ways. And so I took inspiration from that. So, I did a talk last night with Julie Miretu, a painter that I think is amazing, and Kelly Jones, an art historian at Columbia. And Kelly asked a question about legacy. Do you feel that you have a responsibility to claim your legacy, to be that you have been a role model? And I kind of just ducked that question, but I did tell a story about a young Black woman. I was eating in a restaurant in Brooklyn. I had finished my meal. I walked outside. She came running out of the restaurant. It's like, oh my God, I just realized you're Glenn Ligon, the artist. I'm such a fan of your work. I'm an artist myself. You've opened so many doors for me. And it was incredibly moving to me because I thought your work goes out into the world and sometimes the response, but sometimes you don't know. It's just out there. And to have someone say, I saw it, it meant a lot to me, it opened some doors for me in terms of my own work, I thought, well, that is the best kind of response I could have, where the work meant something and facilitated something, changed something for them.
Solange, in many ways, it seems like you've fully embraced the multi-hyphenate identity, which feels much more natural, perhaps, for artists these days. Your son's now a young adult, and it makes me wonder, what does multiplicity look like for the next generation of artists, especially young Black artists?
I think for me, it's an exciting time seeing the evolution of the way future generations are able to show up in the world and able to sort of represent all of these things, and that the world is catching up to the multiplicity in all of us. I think when I was starting to enter in these spaces, I had to fight really hard to apply language to what I was doing or to carve out the messaging of what I was doing. And it's really beautiful to see that those conversations now are really not as valid. So many people bring a multiplicity to what they are doing. So many young people, my son included, want to model, but also want to make the clothing and also want to photograph the clothing and are sort of creating their sense of world making in their own ways. I think as long as the intention is pure and as long as you're willing to humble yourself to become a student to the new spaces that you are entering, that it can be such a fruitful way of the seeingness in yourself and really getting vulnerable with yourself and being able to express these other facets of yourself that deserve to be heard and seen.
Glenn, here's a question. One of my favorite pieces in your book, Distinguishing Piss from Rain, which, by the way, brilliant title, is a piece that you call Advice for a Young Artist. If you had to choose the best bit of advice from that to offer now to the younger generation, what would that be?
One of the things I said in that essay is that you have to come a little hard at the beginning with folks so that they treat you right. And you can be nice later on. Get what you want up front, and then you be nice, Because sometimes being nice up front, that don't get you what you actually need.
Well, thank you. It's been such a pleasure to be able to be with both of you today. Thank you so much for being on Edge of Reason.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn, for all of the incredible work that you have put out into the world and all of the ways that you continue to reinvent how you see and celebrate us. So grateful to be in conversation with you.
Oh, back at you. Delighted that you agreed to do this, but also for your music, your presence, the way you've made platforms for other performers, artists, thinkers. I'm in awe.
I'm Jeff Chang, and you've been on a journey to the Edge of Reason. Join us next week when we speak to Hauser Wirth artist Camille Unroe and author Melissa Phoebos, who explore how attachment and power drives their work. If you've enjoyed what you've just heard, like and review on Apple Podcasts and help spread the word about our series to other listeners like you.